The longhouse breathed like a living creature. Smoke curled from the central hearth, thick and slow in the winter air, carrying with it the scent of pine resin, roasted barley, and sweat-soaked wool. Along the raised benches that ran the length of the timbered hall, warriors sat hunched beneath fur cloaks, their faces flickering in the firelight like carved runestones come to life. Outside, the wind howled across the frozen fjord, slamming snow against the walls like a war drum. Inside, silence had fallen. All eyes were on him. Leif Haldarsson stood just beyond the threshold, the oaken doors still creaking behind him. His boots were caked in the slush of the trail, his woolen cloak damp from the snow, his hair thick, blonde, unkempt to his brow in frozen strands. He was 17 winters old, a man by law, a child by the eyes that now bore into him. At the center of the hall, raised on a dais of polished whalebone and blackened oak, sat his father Jarl Haldar, the iron-handed, so named not for a maimed limb, but for his unyielding will. His beard was streaked with iron gray, his axe glinted at his side, and the chain around his neck bore tokens from raids in Alba, Frisia, and the White Sea. He had killed kings, buried brothers, burned abbeys to their foundations, and he had summoned his son for one purpose. The raid was coming. The longship was ready. The warriors had assembled, and now it was time for Leif to accept the axe. It lay on the wooden table between Thema-bearded blade of forged iron, carved with serpent runes, its ash haft wrapped in seal hide. The axe was ceremonial, yes, but also real. It had drawn blood, carried death across the North Sea. For generations, each Haldarsson had taken it in hand as his rite of passage, and carried it into the world of men. But Leif did not reach for it. Instead, he lifted his gaze to meet his father's hand, spoke words that cracked the foundations of the hall more surely than any earthquake. "I will not fight." A murmur ran through the gathered warriors. Someone shifted on a bench. Someone else muttered, "Is he touched in the head?" But no one laughed. This was no jest. Jarl Haldar's eyes narrowed, and the silence deepened like a storm about to break. "You speak in riddles, boy." "No, father," Leif said quietly, voice steady despite the thunder in his chest. "I speak plainly. I will not raid. I will not kill." A log cracked in the hearth. The flame surged, then died down. The air in the hall felt suddenly thick, as if the gods themselves were watching. Leif heard a faint gasp of his mother, perhaps, but he did not look away. Haldar rose. The iron rings on his tunic clinked together as he stepped down from the dais. Each footfall echoed like a war drum. He came to stand before his son, taller by a head, broader by many hands, and stared down at the youth whose blood ran in his veins, but whose spine, it seemed, was bent in ways he could not understand. "You would shame your kin," he said, his voice low and cold. "I would not shame them. I would spare them," Leif answered. "We have enough blood, enough death. I will serve in other ways." The older man's jaw clenched. "There is no other way." "There is always another way," Leif whispered. The blow came faster than the eye could track a backhand that sent the boy sprawling to the rush-covered floor. Gasps broke from the benches. No one intervened. Leif did not cry out. He did not rise. He simply lay there, blood in his mouth, cheek burning, ribs aching and still. He did not reach for the axe. This, then, was the moment. Not of cowardice, but of refusal. In the world of the Norse, there were few sins greater than refusing to fight. To reject the warrior's path was not simply to defy one's father or clan, was to unravel the threads of a world held together by battle, blood-feud, and the promise of Valhalla. The Norse cosmos was structured by the idea that to live with honor was to die with a weapon in hand. The sagas were filled with names not of those who tilled the earth or mended shoes, but of those who bled on shield walls, whose death songs echoed on foreign shores. To be born male in the Viking age was to be conscripted into a myth, and to step outside that myth was to be cast into the void, not just socially, but spiritually. Those who refused to fight were not merely shamed, they were unspoken, removed, forgotten. They were not called cowards. That word was too easy, too modern. In Old Norse, the insult would come in many forms. Nithing, a man without honor. Arger, unmanly, effeminate, twisted of soul. Scum, shame incarnate. But what did it truly mean to refuse? And what became of those who did? Leif Haldarsson's story is not in the sagas. No skald wrote verses about boys who laid down their axes and took up plows, or books, or silence. But they existed. Archaeology tells us sown graves without weapons, in settlements marked by trade, not war, and the sagas hint at them, in figures laughed at or ignored, men with no glory, but long lives. Men whose stories were erased not by death, but by survival. This is their tale, the forgotten men of the Viking age, the ones who refused. In the age of the Vikings, the axe was more than a weapon. It was a symbol, a covenant, a measure of manhood. To grasp it was to accept the world as it was, red-toothed and raw, ruled by strength and story, where courage counted for more than mercy and legacy more than life. Every village along the rocky coasts of Norway, the pine-clad inlets of Sweden, and the frost-bitten farms of Iceland echoed with the same truth. To be a man was to be a fighter, and to reject the blade was to reject the self. In the sagas, boys were given weapons before they were given women. A son's first axe was often gifted before the age of 12, its haft small, its edge keen. Fathers would teach their sons to split wood, then shields, to hunt deer, then men. Each cut on the training stump mirrored the deeper cuts of inheritance expectation, honor, blood. The oath to fight was not formalized in a ceremony, but it was written in flesh. Scars were proof of loyalty, tales were proof of worth, and death, if it came with weapon in hand, was proof of everything. The warrior's oath, though unwritten, was absolute. I will fight for my kin, for my land, and for my name. I will not die in shame. I will not flee with my back to the enemy. I will meet the end with steel in my hand, and my name on the wind. To refuse that oath was to betray more than tradition. It was to sever the invisible cords binding one to clan and gods alike. To understand the gravity of refusal, we must step into the mind of a Viking warrior. He does not see battle as cruelty, but as destiny. He does not believe peace brings glory, only stagnation. The field soaked with blood is not a tragedy. It is a harvest, and the hall of the dead, Valhalla, not a fantasy. It is real as the cold on his skin and the warmth of mead on his tongue. Consider Arnbjorn, a chieftain's son from the Songfjord, who is recorded in the saga of the Iron Tooth. Arnbjorn slew 3 men at Hafjord, then stood upon the bodies and laughed. Their names are dead, he said. Mine is carved into the root of the world. This was the logic. Each act of violence was a chisel against the stone of obscurity. To refuse to fight was to forfeit your place in this remembered cosmos. From an early age, Viking boys were trained for violence in subtle and explicit ways. They wrestled in the snow until their noses bled. They raced with logs strapped to their backs to build endurance. They threw stones, then spears. They learned to balance on narrow planks above icy streams to simulate ship decks in stormy raids. By adolescence, many had already seen death, livestock slaughter, drowning, illness, and, on occasion, a man struck down in feud. The world gave no illusions. Older warriors passed down stories of raids on Irish monasteries, of fights in Frankish markets, of Slavic shields shattered on the Dnieper. These tales were not just entertainment, they were instruction manuals for greatness. Even death was weaponized in storytelling. He fell with a sword in his mouth. he sang as they opened his belly. His bones are buried beneath the stones of his enemy's hall. To die was not to be feared, but to die unnoticed was. In Norse society, the honor of the individual was deeply tied to the collective. A man who refused to fight brought not only shame upon himself, but a stain upon his family's name. If one brother fought and another did not, the brave brother's legacy was diminished. If a son stayed behind when his father rode to war, the father's standing suffered. A coward in the clan was not dead weight, he was poison. In the saga of Ingemund the Old, a man is cursed not for theft or betrayal, but for hiding during a raid. Better he had never been born than to make his bloodkin blink when their names are spoken. This social logic enforced conformity without chains. The refusal to fight was thus not a private decision, it was a public rupture. In Viking material culture, weapons were worn like names. Archaeological digs reveal graves where the sword or axe lies at the man's side, more prominent than food, beads, or even coins. The weapon defined who he was in death, as it had in life. Carvings from Gotland show warriors entering the afterlife with spears held high. Runestones speak of Halldor, who died bravely with axe raised, and Svein, whose edge knew no peace. To not carry a weapon either in life or into the grave was to declare oneself something other, and other, in a warrior culture, is dangerous. This is the weight Leif Haldarsson carried in his silence. His father had not merely asked him to raid, he had asked him to step into the story, into the eternal war, song of their people. To say no was to reject not just the raid, but the very world his ancestors had carved from ice and iron. And yet Leif said no. In doing so, he threatened not just his own safety, but the myth upon which his society was built. He became something that had no place in the sagas, a boy who would not be a warrior, a son who would not follow the axe. In Viking society, law was not carved into marble tablets or written in distant chamber sit, was spoken into being by memory, blood, and flame. The Norse called it lug, a word that meant more than statute. It meant balance, order, the fragile cords holding kin and clan together, in a world where power was measured not only in silver, but in scars. But beneath this framework of law ran a darker current, a code not merely of justice, but of honor. To the Norse, honor was more than reputation. It was substance, a thing you could feel in your bones, lose in a breath, reclaim only in blood, and it was enforced as ruthlessly as any axe blow. There were no official decrees commanding men to fight in every raid, no parchment with signatures forcing sons to take up arms. But in truth, none were needed. The law of honor was older than writing, and when broken, it condemned a man more thoroughly than any court ever could. To understand how shame functioned as law, we must begin with the concept of neath. This ancient Norse term is often translated as shame or dishonor, but its meaning runs deeper and colder. A neathing was not merely a coward. He was a man outside society, a being whose soul had twisted away from the proper shape. Accusations of neath were devastating because they did not simply insult a man's courage. They questioned his very humanity. In the Egil saga, a man is accused of being arger, a related term meaning effeminate, cowardly, unmanly. It was one of the gravest insults in Viking culture, so serious that it was cause for duel. If left unanswered, it could strip a man of all legal standing. No one would trade with him. No one would marry his daughters. He could be killed without consequence. And while these terms were sometimes used for sorcery or sexual deviance, they were most often wielded against men who refused to fight. Legal texts from Iceland and Norway, particularly the Gragas, compiled in the 12th and 13th centuries, from older oral traditions record indirect references to this concept. While these texts do not explicitly outlaw pacifism, they make clear that manhood was defined through martial readiness. To be unable or unwilling to defend your kin was to make them vulnerable, and vulnerability was death. Thus, refusal to fight could be met with forbogra form of partial outlawry. The man could remain in society, but his legal protections were severely reduced. In more extreme cases, Skogan Grey was imposed. Full outlawry. The man was declared utla gritterly, outside the law. Anyone could kill him, and no blood price would be owed. He was no longer a person in the eyes of the community. He was shadow, mist, prey. What made this system so potent was its informality. Shame did not need a judge. It needed only a whisper. One skaldic verse, mocking a man's cowardice, could follow him for life. One carved neathsting a shame, pole planted near his home, could ruin his entire bloodline. These poles were sometimes carved with obscene runes, topped with a horse's head, and erected facing the home of the shamed man. They were not just insults, they were social executions. Consider the tale of Styrbjorn the Strong, who mocked a rival for hiding behind his wife's skirts during a raid. The insult, though poetic, spread rapidly. The man in question later drowned himself in a fjord, unable to bear the weight of public scorn. The fear of such disgrace was omnipresent. It was a leash even the fiercest men heeded. And while death in battle was a constant risk, living with dishonor was considered far worse. The skalds rarely sang of those who fled. They sang of those who died laughing, spitting in the eye of death. They sang of those who chose a noble end over a shameful breath. This is why Leif Haldarsson's refusal struck like a thunderclap. He did not hide behind injury. He did not claim illness. He simply said no. And in doing so, he stepped into a realm the law had no place. For a realm of silent defiance, where every stare was a verdict, and every day survived was a new trial. It must be said, Viking law was not without nuance. Not every man was a warrior. Some were smiths, farmers, traders, priests. But these men did not refuse battle. They were simply not expected to join it. The shame arose not from non-participation, but from denial, from saying, "This is not who I am," when the world demanded it of you, and especially when you were born to it. A farmer's son might be spared the blade. A jarl's son who turned from it was a scandal. Yet here lies the contradiction that ripples through Norse culture like a shadow in the mead hall firelight. For all their praise of strength, the Vikings were not oblivious to the cost of endless war. Their laws, while brutal, sometimes hinted at space for mercy. A man could pay compensation for killing, could settle feud with silver, could swear oaths, and forge peace. There was, in the law, a recognition that survival sometimes required more than steel, but that recognition was not extended to those who rejected violence outright. The law could forgive a killer. It had no use for a refuser. This reveals the brittle heart of the Viking moral code. Honor was everything, but it was also a cage. A man who lived honorably died young. A man who lived long risked dishonor. And those who questioned this cycle were cast into silence, or exile, or myth. Leif Haldarsson, standing before the hall and denying the axe, was not just breaking tradition, he was breaking the unwritten law, the law of strength, the law of sacrifice, the law that held the longhouse together through frost and feud and famine. And that law, once broken, would exact its price. In the Viking world, memory was a weapon as sharp as any axe, and the sagas were its blade. These long, winding tales, part history, part myth, were the vessels in which honor was preserved and shame was carved into eternity. Told beside hearth fires in the frozen dark, they echoed from generation to generation, carried on the tongues of skalds who wielded verse with the same precision warriors wielded steel. A man might die on some distant shore, his bones lost to the sea, but if his name lived in a saga, he had not truly vanished. To be sung of was to endure, and to be left out, that was the truest death. The sagas are filled with warriors whose deeds tremble on the edge of myth. Egil Skallagrimsson, who split a man's skull down to the teeth. Grettir the Strong, who fought monsters and men alike. Gunnar of Hlithrendi, who leapt his own spear's length to slay a foe. Even the tragic figures, those who die young or make fatal mistakes, are given dignity through the poetry of remembrance. But scattered like broken bones beneath these heroic epics lie quieter stories, glimpses, half-spoken names, characters mentioned once, then never again. And sometimes those silences speak louder than the sagas themselves. In Njal's saga, one of the most revered in Icelandic tradition, we find the tale of Eirin Sigfusson, a man accused, not of cowardice, but of hesitating in battle. His brief moment of doubt becomes a source of mockery, whispered about long after his death. The skalds do not condemn him directly. They do not need to. They surround his name with stronger men, louder stories. He becomes a shadow, a footnote, and for the Viking audience, that was enough. This was the genius and cruelty of the saga tradition. It did not always punish by telling your story poorly. Sometimes it punished by not telling it at all. To refuse the warrior's path was to step into this literary oblivion. For a skald to waste verse on a man who did not fight was to waste breath itself. Poetry was reserved for those who bled, for those who fell with blade in hand and name on lips. Men like Leif Haldarsson, who turned away from war, who stood alone in the longhouse with empty hands, did not enter the saga canon, not because they were unimportant, but because they were dangerous. The sagas were not neutral records. They were tools of cultural enforcement. Every battle they glorified, every death they honored, every revenge they praised, served to reinforce a singular truth. To fight was to matter. To kill was to be remembered. To refuse was to be erased. This is not to say that all sagas are blind to complexity. In the saga of the people of Laxardal, we encounter characters like Kjartan Olafsson, a man torn between violence and peace. He hesitates, reasons, delays action, and yet he is not mocked. His internal struggle is recorded, even respected, but he still fights in the end, still dies in battle. His complexity is only validated because it ends with blood. Even in Egil's saga, the titular hero, a poet as well as a warrior, russes his verse not to avoid combat but to heighten its stakes. He composes death songs before battles. He writes elegies for fallen kin. His poetry is steeped in war. It bleeds. This blending of violence and verse had a profound effect on how Viking masculinity was shaped. To be a man was not just to fight it, was to be worthy of a skald's attention. It was to live in such a way that your name could be forged into rhyme. In this world, even the act of dying could be heroic if the story was good. And so, for those who refused to fight, there was no saga redemption, no tragic arc, no heroic fall, only silence. At most, a line. He did not go to battle. Nothing more. Nothing grand. And in a society that feared obscurity more than death, that was the ultimate punishment. There is a verse from an unknown Icelandic poem, recorded in fragments on a vellum manuscript. Better to die beneath wolf, sky's breath, than live uncarved in memory's stone. To live uncarved was to be forgotten, to leave no mark. This was the fate of the refuser. Yet the sagas also tell us something else, something deeper, buried beneath the ash of warrior pride. They tell us that fear of shame drove many to battle, that men often fought not out of bloodlust, but out of dread of being called Nithingr, dread of their names rotting in the mouths of kin, dread of that most terrible of fates, to be nothing. So what does it say about those who chose that fate, who faced the scorn, the mockery, the silence, and stood unmoved? Perhaps the sagas do not name them because they could not explain them. because such men did not fit into the rhythm of sword and song, because their courage came not from violence, but from refusal, because their strength was the kind you cannot rhyme. Leif Haldarsson may never be sung by skalds. No rune stone bears his name, no tale places him at the prow of a longship, but he exists in the spaces between the stanzas, the silences the sagas leave behind. And in those silences, perhaps, there is a different kind of story, a different kind of saga, one not of blood, but of breath. Leif Haldarsson's refusal did not begin in the longhouse. It began years earlier, beneath the weight of a name and the silence of a legacy. In the world of the Vikings, a man was not born alone. He was born into a lineagia, chain forged in blood, duty, and war. Every link in that chain bore scars. Every ancestor cast a shadow. And for the sons of jarls, those shadows were not simply long, they were suffocating. To be born to a warrior house was to inherit more than land or livestock. It was to inherit a burden. Expectations were not written in law, but they were carved into every glance, every feast, every tale told beside the hearth. From the moment Leif could walk, he was expected to follow in the footsteps of Haldar the Iron-Handed. His father's deeds were legendary. A dozen raids before 30 winters, a Frankish sword taken from a dying knight at the Battle of Jarrow, a silver ring paid in blood and fire. These stories were not just entertainment. They were instruction. They were the mold into which Leif was meant to be poured. At 5, he was given his first toy axe, carved from ashwood and polished with beeswax. At 7, he watched his older cousin return from a raid, missing 3 fingers and grinning like a god. At 10, he was taught to gut a fish, then a hare, then a pig, with the same calm precision. Blood became ordinary, death expected. By 12, he had learned the sagas not just as stories, but as blueprints. He knew which men had failed to act, and how they had been punished by shame or exile. He knew that courage was measured not in thought, but in speed, how quickly one drew steel, how unflinching one's eyes remained in the face of death. He knew that to hesitate was to falter, and to falter was to lose everything. But Leif was not his father. He watched differently, listened longer. When the men of the village spoke of raids, he noted what they didn't say: the haunted stares, the sudden silences, the clenched jaws when asked about the dead. He noticed how some never returned to the longhouse hearth, preferring the solitude of the woods or the company of the drunk. He heard his uncle, once so bold, mutter in his sleep, reliving battles no skald would dare to sing. Leif began to wonder if there was another way to be a man, not lesser, not weaker, just other. But the weight of blood made such thoughts dangerous. In Viking society, family was not simply a private affair, it was public currency. A man's worth was measured in part by the honor of his kin. If your father was brave, you were already half noble. If your brother killed a coward, your own name shone brighter. And if you were born to a jarl, every word, every deed, every hesitation was magnified. A refuser like Leif didn't just shame himself. He cracked the entire foundation. Other clans would whisper, "Haldar's line is soft. His son flinches. His house weakens." Honor, like silver, could be tarnished. It had to be polished, proven, protected. And so, when Leif refused the axe, the deepest wound was not to the village. It was to his father. Jarl Haldar had buried friends and enemies alike. He had faced Frankish steel and Gaelic curses, Saxon arrows and Slavic knives. But nothing in his life had prepared him for the betrayal of his own blood turning from the blade. He did not see Leif's refusal as strength. He saw it as rot, and rot, if left unchecked, spreads. That night, after Leif's refusal, the longhouse did not speak his name. He was not exiled by vote. He was exiled by silence. His mother did not look at him. His cousins, once close as brothers, would not meet his eyes. At the morning meal, his bowl was not filled. At the training field, his place was taken. There was no need for words. The message was clear. Even worse, the shame bled beyond the hall. The traders who passed through the village began to ask quiet questions. Was Haldar's house losing its edge? Would the jarl himself ride on the next raid? Or was age softening his hand? These whispers mattered. Reputation determined alliances, trade, marriage, survival. And so, Leif's refusal rippled outward like a stone in a still pond, disturbing not only his own life, but the equilibrium of the clan. His birthright had promised glory. His blood had demanded vengeance. And yet, he had offered neither. In another world, perhaps such a choice would be accepted. Perhaps a son could choose the plow over the axe, the hearth over the shield. But not here. Not now. Not as the frost thickened on the fjords and the sea promised silver. Leif had broken a bond older than law. He had stood before the gods of his people. Odin, giver of frenzy. Thor, breaker of bone sand, turned his face away. And in doing so, he had broken something else. His place in the unbroken chain of warriors who bore his name. And yet, even in this shattering, something remained. A spark, a question. What is a man, if not his father's echo? And what if the son refuses to echo the cry of war? There was no formal tribunal, no stone court or scroll declaring Leif Haldarsson unworthy. The sentence passed upon him came not from judges, but from eyes, from posture, from silence. In the Viking world, humiliation was not always loud. Often, it came as a murmur, a breath held too long, a glance that slipped past you like wind through an empty hall. And when it was intentional, it was devastating. The Norse had many tools for shaming those who violated the unspoken codes of honor, and they wielded them with the same precision as swords. The most infamous was the Nithanja scorn pole, erected as a public curse and insult. A man accused of cowardice might return from market to find a tall pole planted near his home, topped with the severed head of a horse and carved with obscene runes. The runes would name him a Nithingra, dishonored man, worse than a thief, less than a beast. Such poles were believed to carry magical potency, invoking the spirits of shame, banishment, and decay. Though rare, these poles served as a warning. Defy the code, and you will be named, not by law, but by your people. More subtle and more common was the use of skaldic insult. The Vikings were a poetic culture. Language itself was a weapon. A skilled skald could compose a Nithvisura shame verse targeted like an arrow. These verses mocked cowardice, passivity, or effeminacy, often using double meanings, animal metaphors, and sexual insinuation. Once spoken at a feast or gathering, the verse could not be unsaid. It became part of local memory, recited by children and drunks alike, its sting growing with each retelling. A verse might say, "He sleeps with soft hands and sharper tongue, his sword untouched, his mouth not so." Or, "His axe is buried, not in skull, but soil. He farms like Freyja, not like Thor." These poems were not simply cruel, they were damning. And if the subject did not respond with a duel or act of courage, the verse became his legacy. For Leif, no Nithling was raised. No skald spoke his name. That in some ways was worse. He was not worth cursing, not worth mocking. He was erased. But others took up the work of humiliation. His cousin Bjark, younger by 2 winters but eager to rise in the ranks, took Leif's place at training. Whenever he bested another boy, he would shout, "Give me another Leif, I'll beat him without a blade." Laughter followed. Then came the small exclusions. Leif was left out of the rowing drills. given cold meat at supper, assigned to clean latrines when others gathered for war council. It was a slow, grinding punishment, a communal cold shoulder that wrapped around him like winter, and then came the feast. It was the final night before the longship sailed for the spring raid. The warriors had gathered in full dress cloaks of bearskin, brooches polished, weapons gleaming. Haldar himself wore a circlet of beaten iron, etched with knotwork, signifying his 20 successful raids. The mead flowed. A great ox turned on the spit. The skalds sang of past glories, of men whose names still echoed across the Irish Sea and the rivers of Rus. But when the time came to speak of the sons rising to take their place, the room grew still. Haldar raised his horn. "To those who carry our name forward," he said, his voice steady, "and to those who do not." He did not look at Leif. He didn't need to. Bjark rose and lifted his horn in mock toast. "To the ones who guard the goats while we take the gold." Laughter. A ripple of it, dark and knowing. One man leaned over to another and whispered, "Perhaps the goats will be safer than the men." Another voice muttered, "If Leif joins the battle, the enemy need only ask him nicely to leave." Each comment was a dagger, and Leif, seated at the far end of the hall, felt everyone. He did not rise. He did not speak. He drank nothing, ate little. He simply watched the firelight dance across the faces of men who had once called him brother. Public humiliation in Viking society was not just cruelty. It was correction, a way to push the deviant back into the mold. If a man bore the shame and returned to the path of battle, he could redeem himself. If he refused, the scorn intensified. Eventually, he was no longer mocked. He was forgotten. That was the final phase of ritual shame. Erasure. The name no longer spoken. The stories avoided. The place at the feast unfilled. Some broke under the pressure, took up the sword out of desperation, not conviction. Others left, became wanderers, outlaws, or took service in foreign lands where their past was unknown. A few endured, quietly, without spectacle. They tilled their fields, mended nets, lived long, unremarkable lives. And some, like Leif, bore the shame as a second skin, not because they were weak, but because they had decided that humiliation was preferable to murder. That silence, even scorned, was better than screams on a foreign shore. They paid a price, but not with blood. Erik Thorvaldsson was born beneath a red moon and a storm sky. The old women of the village muttered that such an omen meant conflictor greatness. His mother, a flax-haired widow with hands like bark and a voice like wind through reeds, named him Erik after her father, a merchant lost at sea. His father had died 2 months before Erik's birth in a raid along the coast of Frisia. His ship torched, his bones never found. That death hung over Erik like a fog no wind could lift. He grew up in a stone-framed farmstead nestled between the ironwood grove and the narrow fjord that snaked inland like a waiting serpent. His mother spun wool and traded herbs. His uncle Jorund managed the fishing. And when Erik turned 8, the longhouse elders placed a small wooden sword in his hand and sent him into the training ring, like every other boy. But Erik was not like every other boy. He was tall and quiet, strong, but gentle. He fed the stray dogs before himself, spoke rarely, but remembered every story, every name, every feud, and line of descent. When asked why he hesitated in the ring, why he did not strike the other boys with force, he simply said, "I do not like hurting." They laughed, of course, called him Erik the Gentle. Later, Erik the Green. The names changed as he aged, but the meaning never did. At 12, he bested the village blacksmith's son in a wrestling match by using leverage and balance, not brute strength. Instead of praise, he received silence. The blacksmith's son had already killed a fox barehanded. Eric had nursed an injured raven back to flight. The villagers saw the difference and feared it. When he turned 16, the jarl called every able youth to stand for the spring voyage. The raid was to cross the sea and strike at a monastery on the northern coast of Alba. Riches, fame, the promise of Valhalla. The longship needed strong arms and willing hearts. Eric stepped forward, but not to join. He stepped forward to speak. "I will not fight," he said before the jarl and the gathered men. "I will not kill for silver or songs." The hall fell to silence. The fire cracked. Somewhere, a dog growled low. The jarl narrowed his eyes. "You owe your clan your strength. Your father gave his life for this land." Eric did not flinch. "He did not ask me to follow him. He left me no words, only a burned ship and a widow. I owe my life to my mother, who taught me healing, not war." The jarl laughed bitterly. "Then you will heal alone." And so it was. Eric was not outlawed. He was not cursed or exiled. But neither was he spoken to. The other boys, even those he had helped in the fields, stopped acknowledging him. The men refused to trade unless his mother intervened. A merchant passing through left behind a nithing carved in a fallen pine, not with Eric's name, but with the image of a man with no face, no weapon, no legacy. A warning. Yet Eric endured. He did not run to another village. He did not change his mind. Instead, he built a small shelter further up the fjord, where the birch trees grew dense and the wolves howled at dusk. There he tended herbs. He cared for injured animals. He read the stars, and people began, in secret, to come to him. First, a woman with a sick child, then a fisherman with a broken hand, then a young girl whose brother had been maimed in a feud and was too afraid to sleep. Eric treated them all with calm and care, took no silver, only food or cloth. Word spread quietly. Eric the healer, they called him now. Still not loud enough to counter the shame, but enough to matter. One winter, the raiding ship returned broken and battered. Only 9 men survived. Among them was Bjark, the blacksmith's son, now grown and wounded. His face was half burned, his leg shattered. The village healer had no skill for such injuries. Eric was summoned not by the jarl, but by the blacksmith's wife, who came weeping to his hut in the snow. Eric said nothing. He followed her down the mountain. He worked on Bjark for 3 days, cleaned the wounds, set the bones, fed him broth with his own hands. When the man could not move, Bjark never spoke. But when he recovered enough to sit, he looked at Eric with something like understanding. "You should have been a warrior," he whispered one night. "I am," Eric answered. "But my war is with pain, not people." "Settle, settle." Bjark said nothing more. Eric never raided, never took a wife, never raised a sword. But when he died many years later, it was not in shame or exile. It was in his sleep, beneath a blanket sewn by the women he had helped, with a dog curled at his feet and a carved raven perched above his door. They buried him beneath the ironwood trees. No weapons, no runestone, only a plain stone marked with herbs and a verse carved by one of the skalds who had come to him once, fevered and near death, and lived to tell the tale. He fought no man, but death he delayed, a hand of calm in an age of blades. Eric the unwilling, or perhaps Eric the brave. To refuse the sword in the age of Vikings was not only to defy family and clan, was to risk being severed from the gods themselves. For in the Norse cosmos, where the roots of Yggdrasil stretched across the 9 worlds, and fate was spun by the Norns in threads of iron and blood, there was no afterlife more prized than Valhalla, and there was no greater disgrace than being unworthy of it. Valhalla, the hall of the slain, stood at the heart of Asgard, a vast golden fortress where the bravest warriors gathered after death to feast with the gods. There, beneath the high roof thatched with shimmering shields, the fallen fought each day for sport and glory, and rose each night to feast on the meat of the endless boar. Sarimnir, their wounds vanished, their strength renewed. They drank from horns filled by the goat Heidrun, whose milk became mead, and sat in the presence of Odin himself, the All-Father, god of war, wisdom, and sacrifice. To die with a weapon in hand was to be chosen by the Valkyries, lifted from the battlefield, and borne to this eternal warrior's paradise. But Valhalla had a price. Its gates were barred to those who did not fight. To die in your bed, to fall from illness, to grow old and soft, these were not deaths worthy of Odin's hall. And worse still, to live and reject battle altogether was to forfeit not just entrance to Valhalla, but one's entire place in the cosmological story. For the Norse did not view the afterlife as a neutral terrain. It was a mirror of your deeds, a reflection of your choices. And in that mirror, those who turned from war were cast not in light but in shadow. The alternative was hell, not the fiery torment of later Christian visions, but a cold gray realm ruled by the goddess Hell-daughter of Loki, half beautiful, half rotted, sovereign of the dead, who died without valor. Her hall, Eluthnir, was draped in gloom. Its threshold was called Stumbling Block, its bed named Sick Bed, and its walls were said to drip with sorrow. Those who entered Hell's domain were not necessarily punished, but they were forgotten. There was no song, no battle, no feasting, only silence. Memory faded there, deeds dissolved. And so, for a Viking to die outside of battle was not simply unfortunate, it was spiritually perilous. But to live and refuse battle, that was heresy. This fear is echoed in the Havamal, the high words of Odin himself. Cattle die, kinsmen die, you yourself must die. One thing I know which never dies, the fame of a dead man's deeds. To refuse battle was to choose oblivion, to rob yourself of fame, the immortal force that gave death its meaning. The Viking worldview had no concept of heaven as reward for virtue. There was no celestial weighing of sins or forgiveness. There was only honor or the absence of it. Thus, when Leif Haldarsson refused the axe, it was not only his father's wrath or the clan's judgment he risked, it was the gaze of the gods, and worse, the silence that came after. The Valkyries did not come for men who refused. Their names were not etched on weapons or sung on battlefields. Their souls did not ride with Odin at Ragnarok. They were not counted among the Einherjar, the glorious dead who would fight in the final war. Instead, their spirits were believed to drift, rootless, lost, or else to fall into Hell's pale grasp, never to rise again. There were whispered tales half remembered, rarely spoken of men who died in their huts and whose spirits lingered, wailing, restless dead, Draugr, not because they were wicked, but because they had no place, no ending worthy of memory. Their refusal had severed them not only from life, but from story. And yet, the old ways were not entirely without ambiguity. Some traditions, older and wilder than the sword songs of Odin, offered different paths. In the oldest sagas, and in the practices of the Vanir cults earthbound and rooted in fertility, not Warther, were other afterlives, places of peace, of cycles, of return. Folkvangra, the field of the goddess Freyja, was said to receive half the dead. Some tales suggest she chose her own, separate from Odin's warriors, perhaps those who died with dignity, even if not in battle. The sea god Njord may have offered rest to those who died on the waves, whether in war or work. Ran, the goddess of drowned sailors, caught their souls in her net. But these were liminal hopes, marginal, softened at the edges. In the main, Norse cosmology centered on a brutal economy of glory. You either fought and earned eternal remembrance or you faded. The skalds never composed odes to men in hell. The runestones do not record the deeds of healers, or thinkers, or men who simply said no. They commemorate warriors, men who died with blood in their mouths and axes in their hands. So what does that mean for those like Eric the Healer, or Leif Haldarsson? What becomes of the soul that chose to live without spilling blood? Perhaps they were not taken by Valkyries, nor sung by skalds. Perhaps they did not ride at Ragnarok, but perhaps, in their quiet defiance, they achieved a different kind of immortality, not in the eyes of the gods, but in the eyes of those they spared, those they healed, those they refused to harm. Perhaps Valhalla was not denied them. Perhaps they simply chose another hall. Part 9. The Other Realms, Alternate Afterlives. Valhalla was not the only hall in the Viking imagination. For all the fame it gained in later centuries, the Norse afterlife was far more complex, an entangled web of realms, gods, and destinies, shaped not only by how one died, but how one lived. The soul of a Viking did not always rise in glory or fall in disgrace. Sometimes it wandered, sometimes it returned, and sometimes it went somewhere else entirely. Beyond the shield-gleaming gates of Odin's hall stood Folkvanger, the field of the people, ruled by Freyja, goddess of love, fertility, magic, and war. Like Odin, she chose from the slain. The Prose Edda tells us that Freya receives half of those who fall in battle, and Odin the other half. This division raises questions. Why would a goddess of beauty and fecundity claim the bloodied dead? And who were her chosen? Some scholars suggest Freyja's warriors were not selected for how they died, but for why. While Odin's Einherjar were destined for Ragnarok, his private army in the coming apocalypse, Freyja's dead may have found gentler rest. Folkvanger was said to be fertile, peaceful, golden with sun and grass. There the dead feasted not in preparation for war, but in celebration of life. For a man who fought to protect kin, rather than conquer strangers, for one who killed only when needed, and not in madness, Freyja's field may have opened its gates. It's possible, then, that not all warriors went to Odin, and not all refusers were denied every hall. Further still lay Helgafell, the holy mountain. It was not a realm of gods, but of ancestors, a quiet place, sacred and somber, believed to exist within the physical world. Some Norse communities held that the dead of their village gathered on the mountaintop, where they continued their lives in a mirrored but gentler world. There they fished, feasted, and farmed in peace. In Helgafell, valor was not a requirement. Presence was enough. To be buried facing the mountain was to return to one's people, to sleep among kin. This was a realm not of warriors, but of folk, those whose lives were defined not by death but by continuity. And then there were the sea dead. Ran, the net-wielding goddess of the drowned, ruled the deep, along with her husband, Aegir, god of the ocean's rage and revelry. Sailors who perished in storm or shipwreck were said to be taken into her hall beneath the waves. It was not Valhalla, but it was not hell. It was wild, elemental. The Norse were coastal people, their lives and deaths entwined with the sea. To drown was not necessarily a dishonor, and for those like Eric the Healer, who lived by the fjord, who rode but never raided Rand's embrace, might have offered a kind of final rest. The Norse even imagined the dead returning. In some tales the soul was not a single thing, but a set of forces: the hugr, mind, will; the heminga, luck, fortune; the fylga, spirit guide; and the lif, vital essence. These parts could be reborn. A child might inherit an ancestor's hamingja, A dream could carry a visit from one's Filja. The boundaries between life and death were porous, not fixed. For those who did not fight, but lived meaningfully raising families, healing wounds, speaking wisdom, this belief allowed a kind of return. Their virtues could echo, not through steel and saga, but through subtle legacies, a quiet strength, passed from mother to daughter, father to son, a way of being rather than a way of dying. Even in Hell's cold embrace, ambiguity lingered. Though feared by warriors, Hell's realm was not described as a place of punishment. It was simply still, reflective. The souls there were not tormented, but forgotten. This forgetting was the true Norse fear. Not fire, not pain, but erasure, to be unspoken, unremembered, unnamed. Yet in small communities, even the quietest lives left marks. A healer might not make the sagas, but his herbs still grew. A farmer's wisdom echoed in the way a field was planted. A weaver's touch remained in the clothes passed down 2 generations. These legacies were not sung, but they lasted. And in a culture that feared being lost, lasting in any form held sacred weight. Some mystery cults may have embraced these other realms openly. In remote parts of Sweden, burial mounds contained figures laid to rest not with weapons but with tools, plows, looms, knives for carving wood, offerings of food, not arms, runes carved not in boasts but in prayers. These graves suggest a vision of the afterlife, not bound by bloodshed. They hint at a philosophy of continuation, not conquest. Perhaps these were the refusers, or their kin, or simply those who saw the world not as a battlefield, but as a garden, a home, a story still unfolding. The Norse worldview, for all its brutality, was not without room for nuance. Beneath the roaring battle cries and mead hall bravado lay an older current tone that remembered the soil, the sea, the stars, one that whispered of other realms. For Leif Haldarsson, who chose not to kill, who endured shame but kept his hands clean, perhaps Valhalla was closed. But Folkvanger, Helgafell, the deep halls of Ran, perhaps those doors opened quietly, not with the thunder of Valkyrie wings, but with wind through pine, with silence, with peace. There were those who never fought, and then there were those who had fought and walked away. These men were fewer still, and more complicated. For in a world where battle was identity, and glory the only insurance against obscurity, to step away from violence after tasting it was an act almost beyond comprehension. Yet it happened. The sagas mention it in the margins. The earth reveals it in its bones. These were not the cowards nor the born refusers. They were warriors who had once drawn blood, who had stood on the prow of ships beneath foreign suns, who had raised their voices in the shield walland, who had come home changed. Something in them shifted, broke, or opened, and when the longhouse once again filled with war fever and the oaths began to be spoken, these men stayed seated, said nothing, picked up no axe, and the silence around them was colder than steel. What made them turn away? In some cases it was age. The body fails before the will. A man who had served in 5 or 6 raids might simply be too broken to march, but these were not the ones who walked away. These were the ones left behind. The ones we speak of here made the choice before their strength failed. They were still capable, still deadly, but something within had shifted. The sagas rarely name them, but they whisper their presence. In the saga of the Greenlanders, there is an old man named Thorvald, who once fought beside Eric the Red. He returns from a final voyage and builds a small farm near the coast. When asked why he no longer sails, he replies, "I have seen too much of men's skulls emptied by greed." That line is all the saga gives him. No more verses, no arc, just a ghost on the edge of a warrior's tale. But archaeology fills in the spaces. In a burial mound outside of Ribe, Denmark, a grave was uncovered, containing a man aged around 55. His bones showed signs of healed wounds, deep cuts to the ribs, a shattered forearm, a cracked orbital socket. He had lived through violence, and yet no weapons were buried with him. Only a whittling knife, fishing hooks, and a small leather pouch containing medicinal herbs. His grave was humble but respected. No shame runes, no isolation. His descendants had left offerings, amber beads, a carved bone comb, dried berries. Not gifts for a war hero, gifts for a grandfather. Why would a warrior walk away? Perhaps it was the weight of killing. In the sagas, battle is often described with poetic distances, words, biting shields, men feeding the ravens. But in the details, pain seeps through. Warriors vomiting after combat, men weeping in the night, survivors refusing to eat, or speak, or sleep near others. The Norse had no word for trauma, but they knew its shape. Some who walked away did so after a failed raid when comrades died screaming, and the gods did not answer. Others did so after seeing what battle truly was. Not glory, but fire, screaming, children caught in the crossfire. Perhaps they returned home and could no longer look at the axe without hearing the cries. Perhaps they buried a friend. Perhaps they saw themselves in the eyes of a man they killed. Something cracked, and when it did, they chose silence. These men became outliers, not hated, not always mocked, but not celebrated either. Their names faded. The skalds skipped their verse. They were not outlaws, nor were they heroes. They lived between. Some turned to the land, farming, fishing, working leather or bone. Their hands, once used for killing, turned toward sustenance. They became useful, quiet, not spiritual perhaps, but grounded. In Norse terms, they turned inward, no longer chasing fröðleikur, fame, but friður, peace. Others turned to the gods in strange ways. In parts of Iceland, there are tales of old warriors who built solitary shrines in the forest not to Odin, but to Thor, or even the land spirits. They offered carvings, lit fires, said prayers in languages older than the sagas. These men were not Christian, but neither were they entirely pagan in the traditional sense. They had seen too much of war to worship it. There are hints, too, that some went east not to raid, but to vanish. The river routes to Byzantium and beyond offered escape. A man could join the Varangian Guard and find structure, distance, purpose, or he could melt into the cities of the Slavs, the steppes of the Rus, become something else, foreign, forgotten. The Norse called these men utlendir, outsiders. It was not always a curse, just a fact, a way of saying, he left and became other. The family left behind often spoke little of them. A father who walked away from war was hard to explain in a culture that raised boys for battle, but occasionally hints remain. In land records, where a warrior's name is scratched through and replaced with his son's. In songs that speak of the silent ones who watched the sea but did not sail. And in graves, again, the proof. Men once armored, now buried simply. A comb, a knife, a bowl of earth. The story of the Viking warrior often ends in fire and steel, but sometimes it ended in snow, in a hut, with a fire crackling low and a man staring into it, not with regret, but with something more complicated, a weariness, a choice. To walk away was not to be weak. Sometimes it was the bravest thing a warrior ever did. When the longships returned, they brought more than silver and stories. They brought silence. Men who had left as eager boys with calloused hands and untested courage came back different, quieter, harder, or in some cases, hollow. In Viking culture, there was no word for trauma, no healer trained to treat the soul. And yet, the signs were there, written in the way a man no longer sang, or laughed, or met his child's gaze. The wounds were invisible, but they bled all the same. These were the silent returners warriors who came back from battle, but never truly came home. To the outside world they were successful. Their arms bore scars. Their belts hung heavy with foreign coins. Their stories, when told, could still silence a hall. But in private, many of these men unraveled. Some stopped sleeping through the night. The sagas occasionally mention men who woke screaming from dreams. Others developed strange habit checking the doors again and again, staring into fires for hours, jumping at the clatter of wood on stone. One tale from the saga of the Inglings describes a warrior who heard the cries of dying men in the wind and took to sleeping outside, away from his family. These descriptions, though veiled in mythic language, echo the symptoms of what modern understanding calls post-traumatic stress. There were others who simply faded, returned to the village, but no longer participated. They sat at feasts, but did not speak. They worked, but mechanically. If questioned, they gave short answers or changed the subject. In a culture where stoicism was expected, such behavior was not interrogated, it was endured. These men became ghosts in their own halls, haunted and haunting. The emotional cost of violence was seldom acknowledged, but always present. Consider the story of Ketil Flatnose, a historical figure mentioned in several sources. After leading a series of brutal campaigns across the Hebrides, he retired to a small farm in Iceland. He lived out his days quietly, refusing all offers to return to war. Some say he became religious. Others say he simply lost the taste for killing. One fragment of verse attributed to his descendants says, "My father's hands, once strong, now tremble when he holds the knife for bread." In another tale, a warrior named Hrafn returned from a raid in the east with a chest of silver and a 1,000-yard stare. Though victorious, he refused to sleep indoors. He built a small lean-to beside the river and lived there until his death, muttering to himself in a language no one understood. The villagers said he had seen a demon. Others whispered he had become one. The trauma also passed between generations. Sons raised by silent fathers often inherited the silence. In some families, war became a cycle of unspoken pain. Grandfathers who never told their stories. Fathers who drank too much mead and stared at the wall. Sons who followed them into the shield wall, not out of glory, but to understand the thing that had broken their kin. And yet the culture had no tools to address it. There were no rituals for healing the heart. No gods invoked to soothe the mind. Odin, the god of war and wisdom, demanded sacrifice and foresight, but not mercy. Thor, the protector, offered strength, not solace. Freyja, who knew love and loss, might have understood, but her rights were secret and not meant for men broken by war. In this vacuum, some men turned to isolation, others to the bottle. Mead and ale, already central to Viking feasts, became medicine of a kind numbing pain, dulling memory. But the sagas hint at the cost. Warriors who drank themselves into oblivion, feasts that ended in weeping or violence. One tale tells of a man who killed his own brother during a drunken rage, then vanished into the mountains. No one ever found his body. Still, there were rare cases of transformation. A few broken warriors became poets. The skalds were not always born, they were forged, often by fire and grief. Verse offered a kind of structure, a way to frame the chaos. In Egil's saga, the warrior poet composes a dirge for his drowned son that transcends personal grief and becomes almost mythic. His verses are not about battle, but about sorrow, aging, emptiness. It is one of the earliest and clearest expressions of internal pain in all Norse literature. Others turn to healing. A man who once cut flesh in war might learn to sew wounds in peace. Bones remembered, even when minds broke. There are archaeological records of warriors buried with tools of medicine herbs, knives, bandages. Perhaps they could not undo what they had done, but they could balance the scales, one wound at a time. The community's response was mixed. Some villagers respected the silent ones, honored them from a distance. Others feared them. A man who had seen too much was unpredictable, dangerous, or worse, he reminded others of what they had done and what it meant. And so, many silent returners were gently exiled, not driven out but encouraged to leave, given a boat, a pack, a blessing spoken through clenched teeth, and they went into the woods, into the mountains, to the edge of the known world, to find peace or die trying. Leif Haldarsson watched them sometimes from his farm on the fjord, men who came back gaunt and silent, walking like ghosts among the living. He did not speak to them, but he understood. He had never fought, but he carried a different burden weight of choosing not to, and in the eyes of the silent returners, he sometimes glimpsed something close to kinship. They had spilled blood and regretted it. He had chosen not toned, been scorned, but they both lived in the space between. Not cowards, not heroes, just men. Not all honor was earned with blood. Though Viking society placed warriors at the top of the social chain, it was built upon the backs of those who worked the land, mended wounds, and kept the longhouses warm through the endless dark of winter. The sword may have carved glory, but it was the plow, the net, and the healing hand that sustained life. These were quieter paths, older than the axe, and in some corners of the Norse world, they held their own kind of reverence. The Jarl, the free farmer, was the backbone of Viking society. Not a thrall, not a noble, but something in between. He owned land, raised livestock, paid tribute to the jarl, and brought his sons to the Thing, the great gathering where law was spoken and disputes were judged. He might have fought in his youth, but his true work was the land. His pride lay not in silver from raids, but in the weight of his harvest, the health of his cattle, the strength of his sons. When a village survived the cruel breath of winter, it was the Jarls who made it possible. Archaeological digs in Iceland, Norway, and parts of rural Sweden have unearthed longhouses with no weapons buried nearby, but tools in abundance: iron-tipped plows, scythes, spindles, and grindstones. These were not the graves of cowards. They were the resting places of those who kept the earth alive. Some even bore runic inscriptions. He kept the fields fat, or her hands fed the hall. Simple words, but words of respect. Fishing communities held a different kind of honor. Along the fjords and coasts, men who never set foot on a foreign shore braved the sea's fury to feed their people. They knew danger not from swords, but from storms. A fisherman's death was no less final than a warrior's. His body might be claimed by the sea, dashed against rocks, or frozen in the spray of an unexpected gale. The sea demanded courage different from the battlefield, but just as real. The gods themselves bore witness to these paths. Njord, god of seafaring and fishing, was worshipped by coastal folk. Freyr, god of fertility and the harvest, received offerings from farmers seeking strong crops. These deities, less glamorous than Odin or Thor, reflected a more grounded power: abundance, survival, peace. Not all Norse spirituality was tied to battle. And then there were the healers. Rare, precious, and sometimes feared, they occupied a liminal space in the Viking world. A healer might be a wise woman, a vulva, versed in herbs, chants, and runes, or he might be a man who had walked away from war, turned blade to bandage. These figures understood the body not to destroy, but to restore. They carried knowledge passed down in whisper show to brew infusions of meadowsweet for pain, how to stop bleeding with moss and cobwebs, how to set a broken bone with splints carved from ash wood. In sagas, Such people are often portrayed with awe and suspicion. They were needed but not always trusted. In Laxdala saga, there is mention of a woman who knew the plants that grew in shadow and the words that soothed the wounded. She is neither named nor condemned. She exists in the story like a stream beneath ice, essential but hidden. In another tale, an aging warrior who could no longer hold a sword used his knowledge of battle wounds to treat younger men. The saga calls him the one whose hands did not forget. Again, a hint, a glimmer of another kind of honor. These paths were not shameful. They were simply not sung. The skalds, who shaped public memory, favored the roar of battle, not the rhythm of planting or the silent grace of healing. But in the villages, in the homes warmed by firelight and bound by kinship, people remembered. They remembered who brought in the harvest, who cured the sick, who caught the fish that fed the feast. Leif Haldarsson found his place among them. After his refusal, after the long silence, he moved to the edge of his village and began to grow things. At first, nothing but barley and onions. Later, herbs for wounds, teas for fever, poultices for pain. He had no teacher, only fragments of his mother's wisdom, the pages of a Latin herbal traded from a monk, and his own steady hands. At first no one came. Then a child fell from a cart and broke her arm. The usual remedia prayer and a swaddling board failed. Leif set the bone. It healed clean. Word spread, quietly. Soon warriors returning from raids brought him fevers. Women came to him with sick infants, old men with swollen joints. He never refused anyone, not even those who had mocked him. He spoke little, accepted no coin, only bread, or a story, or silence. Years passed. At the next thing, his name was spoken aloud for the first time in a decade. A farmer had nominated him as Mather Frithera, Man of Peace, an unofficial title, but one that carried weight. When Leif died, his grave was simple. No axe, no helm, only a small stone bowl filled with dried herbs and a carving of a plant curling from soil toward sun. It bore no boast, no verse, just 3 runes, etched with care. He chose to mend. In a world obsessed with glory, there was still space for quiet honor, for those who fed instead of fought, who healed instead of harmed, who lived fully and died remembered not in saga, but in soil. Viking society is often remembered as a world of men-bearded warriors with axes raised, sails full of storm wind, eyes set on conquest. But this vision leaves half the story untold. Women were not only weavers of cloth and keepers of the hearth. They were spiritual leaders, farm stewards, traders, and, in some rare and storied cases, warriors. Yet even among women, the question of refusal lingered. For every shield maiden who chose the sword, there were many more who chose not to. And their choices, like Leif Haldarsson's, shaped the Norse world in quieter, deeper ways. The shield maiden occupies a strange space in Norse mythology and memory. She is both real and symbolic, a woman who defies traditional roles by taking up arms and joining the ranks of male warriors. The sagas speak of women like Lagertha, who fought beside Ragnar Lodbrok, and Hervor, who summoned the spirit of her dead father to claim his sword. These stories are legendary, dramatic, and few, but archaeology supports their possibility. Graves like that of the Birka warrior woman once thought male, until DNA analysis proved otherwise, suggest that some women did indeed fight, lead, and die as warriors. Yet even these exceptional women were framed within the warrior ideal. Their honor, like that of their male counterparts, was tied to battle. They were celebrated not for being women, but for being willing to do what men did: to kill, to die, to fight with fury and fire. But what of the women who refused that path? Who chose not to fight, not because they were weak, but because their power took other forms? In Viking society, power was not limited to the battlefield. Women controlled households, which were not simply domestic spaces, but economic centers. A capable housewife was more than a cook or cleaner. She managed servants, oversaw food production, negotiated trade, and preserved the wealth of the family. The keys she wore at her belt were not decorative, they were symbols of authority. In her hall, the woman ruled. Women also played central roles in religion and ritual. The Vilvasiris, or prophetess, among the most revered spiritual figures in Norse society. She carried a staff, spoke with the dead, interpreted dreams, and performed seether, a form of magical practice that bent fate itself. Odin, the Allfather, was said to have learned seether from Freya, the goddess of magic and war, who in turn was served by legions of wise women. The Valva was feared and honored in equal measure. She did not fight with a blade. She fought with words, visions, herbs, and sacred songs. To walk this path required strength, patience, isolation. Many Ver lived alone or traveled between villages, called only in times of crisis. Their refusal to take part in ordinary life, marriage, motherhood, warfare, was a kind of sacrifice, a different kind of battle, and though they were often viewed with suspicion, they were never mocked. Their refusal held power. Younger women, too, could choose refusal of marriage, refusal of childbearing, refusal to serve a husband's ambition. While Viking society permitted more freedom than many of its contemporaries, it still expected women to fit certain roles, to bear sons, to support warriors, to grieve their dead, and raise more. A woman who resisted this cycle could face scorn, isolation, even accusations of her geith, same word used to shame men who failed to uphold masculine codes. Yet some did refuse. The sagas speak quietly, briefly of women who chose solitude, who became smiths, midwives, herbalists, traders. One saga tells of a woman who refused 3 marriage proposals and was finally declared stone-hearted, a term not of contempt but of resignation. She lived alone, kept goats, and was remembered for her stubborn peace. Another speaks of a widow who, after her husband's death in battle, took her children and moved to a remote valley. There she raised them with no swords, no training in war. They grew into builders, craftsmen, singers. These choices were not immortalized in verse, but they were known and remembered. The maternal line, often hidden behind the deeds of men, shaped the values of generations. A son might raise a sword, but he was raised by a woman. A daughter might marry a jarl, but she learned strength at her mother's knee. And in households where fathers had died in battle, it was the mother who decided what path her children would walk. Some chose the old way, straining, feuds, oaths. Others, like Leif Haldarsson's mother, taught a different lesson: how to endure, how to heal, how to live without taking life. In some regions, especially in Iceland, women had legal power to own property, inherit land, and initiate divorce. Their words carried weight at the thing. Their choices mattered. And so, when a woman chose to guide her family away from violence, it was not cowardice. It was a redirection of the clan's future, a quiet defiance, a refusal echoed in generations. There were also women who refused after war, widows of slain warriors who refused to remarry, mothers of fallen sons who turned to ritual or exile or silence. Their grief was not just sorrow, it was a form of protest, a withdrawal from the cycle of blood that had consumed their kin. Some became wanderers, others became midwives, determined to bring life into the world instead of watching it cut down. Their stories live in the cracks of the sagasin, the names half-spoken, the graves with loom weights instead of blades, the quiet shrines at the forest's edge. They were not shield maidens, nor were they saints. They were women who refused, and in doing so, they shaped the soul of the Norse world as surely as any sword. For centuries, the Norse world defined valor through violence. The warrior was the ideal, his courage proven in raids, his honor measured in blood. But with the coming of Christ, a new and alien code entered the longhouses and thing assemblies of Scandinavia. It did not arrive all at once, and it did not arrive peacefully. But slowly, relentlessly, it began to shift the very axis of Norse belief. And for the first time in living memory, refusal was not only permitted, it became sacred. The first waves of Christianity came not with swords, but with silver and scripture. Traders from the south brought crosses alongside coins. Missionaries, often monks in homespun robes, walked into the strongholds of lords and kings, carrying no weapons, only books. Some were laughed at, others were killed, a few were listened to. They spoke of a God who had suffered rather than struck back, who had died for his enemies instead of conquering them. This God forgave. This God blessed the meek. This God said, "Love your enemies," a phrase that, to Norse ears, sounded like madness. And yet the idea took root. Why? Because the Norse world was changing. Kingdoms were consolidating. Warfare was no longer the chaotic dance of clan. Feudsit was becoming organized, state-sanctioned, politicized. For chieftains and jarls, Christianity offered new power. Written law, royal legitimacy, alliances with the mighty empires to the south. For common people, it offered something else, a way to escape the crushing cycle of violence, an end to vengeance, a promise of rest. With the rise of Christ, refusal could be reframed not as cowardice, but as sanctity. Monks and priests began to preach the virtues of peace. To kill was not honorable, but sinful. To die in battle did not grant you glory, it endangered your soul. True courage, they said, was in restraint. True strength in forgiveness. The greatest heroes of the Christian tradition were martyrs, those who died without striking back. Their names were carved into stone, sung in churches, remembered for centuries. For a young man like Leif Haldarsson, whose refusal had once marked him as a disgrace, the new faith offered refuge. He had been mocked for laying down the axe. Now, there were entire orders of men who did the Sam monks, who lived without violence, who healed the sick, fed the poor, prayed for the dead. Their lives were not wasted, they were exalted. The first Norse converts were cautious. Kings like Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson, later Saint Olaf, baptized by sword point, forcing entire regions to accept the new faith. But even these warrior kings understood the deeper transformation underway. They outlawed blood feuds, built churches, supported laws that favored peace over retribution, and in doing so they opened the door for a new kind of honor. A man who refused to fight because of Christ was no longer weak, he was faithful. Christianity gave names to the virtues that had once gone unsung: mercy, humility, compassion. It gave language to the suffering that warriors carried home in silence. Where the sagas mocked men who wept, the Gospels praised those who mourned. Where the old gods demanded strength, the new God comforted the broken. In time, monasteries became havens for those who could not fight or would not. Some were the sons of warriors, born into blood but unwilling to carry the blade. Others were battle-hardened men who had seen too much and sought peace in Scripture. They took vows of poverty, chastity, obedience. They tilled the earth, copied manuscripts, prayed. Their new hall was not Valhalla, but heaven. Leif Haldarsson, in his later years, was said to have built a small chapel on the edge of the fjord. He did not preach. He did not baptize. But he welcomed a wandering priest, an Irishman named Iadon, who spoke little of battle and much of love. Together, they tended the sick, shared meals, read psalms by firelight. The villagers still did not fully understand, but they no longer scorned. When Leif died, it was Aidan who buried him, not with a sword, but with a cross carved into driftwood. not with a saga, but with a prayer. The rise of Christ did not erase the old ways overnight. For generations, the two belief systems coexisted, sometimes in harmony, often in tension. Sagas were still sung, swords were still raised, but beneath it all, something fundamental had changed. Refusal was no longer exile, it could now be salvation, and in that transformation, the Norse world began to birth a new kind of Heronot, the one who conquered, but the one who forgave, not the one who sang of blood, but the one who turned the other cheek, not the one who died in battle, but the one who lived in peace. The gods of old had demanded honor through war. The new God offered peace through grace. And for men like Leif, who had borne the weight of refusal in silence, that grace was not only divine, it was liberation. Some men who refused to fight vanished into the crowd, others vanished into legend, and some simply vanished into the mountains, the forests, the edges of maps and memory. In Norse society, there were few places more dangerous than the boundary between civilization and wilderness. But for those who could no longer live within the rules of honor, kinship, and warfare, the wild offered something that halls and hearths could not silence: freedom and a harsh, uncertain peace. These men were not all broken. Some were ascetics, spiritual seekers, men who looked upon the world's violence and turned not to sword or cross, but to solitude. Others were declared utle grut laws, not for killing, but for failing to kill when honor demanded it. In the harsh logic of Norse law, a man who refused to avenge a blood feud, or who refused to fight when insulted, could be seen as betraying the expectations of kin and community. And betrayal, even through inaction, was a wound that had to be excised. Outlawry was not a jail sentence. It was an erasure. The law no longer protected you. You could be robbed, beaten, even killed without legal consequence. You could not be helped, housed, or spoken for at the thing. The world did not punish you, simply ceased to acknowledge you. And so, such men left. They walked into the cold. Some found the edge of a river or a hidden grove, and built small huts from stone and driftwood. Others carved shallow caves in cliff faces. Some lived by trapping, others by fishing, others by begging at the margins of villages where their names were no longer recognized. They were not always hated, but they were avoided. The boundary they had crossed was deeper than exilite, was existential. The sagas speak of such figures obliquely. In Grettir's saga, Grettir himself becomes an outlaw not for refusal, but for being a threat to order. Yet among the people, his name still carries weight. He is feared and admired in equal measure. He lives in isolation, hunted, a figure of dread and fascination. But Grettir fights. He is violent. His story, though tragic, remains within the warrior frame. Others are harder to find. The unnamed figures who appear at the fringes of tale shermits, madmen, old warriors turned wild. One tale from eastern Iceland speaks of a man who once led raids in the west, then returned from a voyage and took to the hills. He spoke to no one, wore a coat of bark, carved strange runes into standing stones. When asked why he had left society, he replied only, "I know the cost. His name is lost, but the stone remains." End of quote. These men were not saints, nor were they cowards. They were something else, witnesses, perhaps. Men who had looked too deeply into the abyss of their own culture and stepped back, not toward another people or faith, but into themselves. Some became ascetics in the truest sense of denying pleasure, denying company, seeking a kind of clarity that could only come through hunger, cold, and solitude. They did not preach, they did not write, but occasionally they were remembered. In northern Sweden, a burial mound known only as the Man Without House contains a skeleton dressed not in furs or armor, but in a rough-spun wool robe, Around him were no weapons, only carved wooden talismans, bundles of herbs, and a single stone etched with a spiral. No grave goods, no kin markers. And yet, the grave was carefully constructed. Someone had honored him. In oral tradition, there are stories of wild men who knew the animals better than people, who could speak to wolves, who walked barefoot in snow and left no prints. They were said to be touched by the godsore cursed, but perhaps they were neither. Perhaps they had simply seen enough, chosen silence over song, chosen the trees over the hall. The line between outcast and mystic was thin. For some, this boundary became a form of power. They were consulted in secret, asked for visions, for guidance. They spoke few words, but when they did, people listened, because they had walked where others dared not. They had left the world without dying. The church would later call them heretics or fools, but in the old ways they were more complicated. They were reminders of what the cost of glory could be, of what remained when the song ended and the fire burned low. Leif Haldarsson, though not an outlaw, came to understand this edge. He befriended one such man in his later Yrsa, former warrior turned wanderer, who lived in the pine forests beyond the fjord. The villagers called him Skjaldar, though no one knew if that was his name or a title. He wore stitched hides, spoke little, and came to Leif's hut only in winter. They sat by the fire, said nothing, shared broth. When Skjaldar died, Leif buried him under a cairn of river stones, far from any path. There was no marker, only a branch laid across the top. The wild was not a place of punishment. It was a place of reckoning, of exile chosen or enforced. And for those who had refused war or fled its ghosts, it was sometimes the only place left. Not Valhalla, not hell, just wind in the trees, and a name whispered only by the ravens. Beyond the farms and fjords, past the edge of the roads walked by kings and raiders, lay the forests vast, dark, unknowable. To the Norse, these woods were more than wilderness. They were alive. They breathed with old gods and older spirits, and in their depths, far from the longhouse and the thing, whispers took root. Whispers of cults, rites, and quiet refusals, forms of belief that did not worship the axe or the sword, but something else, something older, something rooted. These were not cults in the modern sense of fanaticism or hierarchy. They were gatherings, clusters of belief and practice, bound not by doctrine but by place. Forest cults existed in the liminal spaces of Norse society, not outlawed but not approved, not heretical but not heroic. Their power lay in secrecy, in silence, in resistance. Archaeological traces of these groups are rare but telling. In the dense woods of eastern Sweden and the uplands of Norway, sites have been uncovered where no longhouses stood, only circles of stone, animal bones arranged with care, and crude wooden idols with softened faces. These sites lack the martial offerings typical of Odin or Thor. Worship no swords, no broken shields, no warrior graves. Instead, they contain tools of fertility, carved phalluses, womb, like vessels, seeds, offerings of honey, milk, and mushrooms, not blood. These were spaces of life, not death. Scholars debate who led these rites. Some believe they were guided by women volar, herbalists, midwives, keepers of the veneer traditions, which honored the land, the cycle, the growing thing. Others point to aging warriors who had renounced their past, seeking absolution, not through penance, but through planting. There are even tales buried in folk memory of children raised entirely in the forest, untouched by feud or raid, taught not the sagas but the stones. The gods worshipped in these cults were not the great names of Asgard, not Odin, with his hunger for war, not Thor, with his hammer raised, but Nerthus, an earth mother whose cart was drawn by cows and whose presence required silence. Freyr, god of peace, fertility, and golden sunlight. Njord, who watched over wind and tide, not conquest. These deities did not demand sacrifice through death. They asked for reverence, for care, for ritual offerings of bread, barley, and clean water. One surviving account, written by a Christian monk visiting Jutland, describes a strange grove where no blade is drawn, where the people walk barefoot and speak to the trees. He calls it pagan and dangerous, but also admits that the people there were gentle and given to long prayer. The monk, likely trained to see any non-Christian rite as suspect, nonetheless notes the peace of the place. The absence of fear. These cults were not anti-war in the modern sense, but they were built around a principle foreign to the saga world: refusal. They did not celebrate the warrior's death. They honored the tiller of soil, the bringer of rain, the midwife's hand. To join was not to renounce courage, but to redefine it. Strength was not in blood spilled, but in harvests grown, not in dying gloriously, but in enduring quietly. It is possible, though not provable, that some of these cults protected refusers. Men like Leif Haldarsson, who could not or would not take up arms, may have found shelter among them. These groups did not advertise themselves. They had no rune stones. Their rites were passed by touch, by voice, by example, a way of planting the same way each spring, a chant sung to the moon, a mushroom picked only under cloudlight. These traditions may stretch back to the pre-Viking Age Bronze Age survivals clinging to the roots of newer, louder gods. In the peat bogs of Denmark, where well-preserved sacrifices have been found, some show signs not of battle death, but of ritual drowning or gentle internment. Bodies laid in water, not burnt on pyres, perhaps not killed, but given to the earth, to the forest, to something that asked not for war, but for return. In one tale from the Flateyjarbók, there is mention of a woman named Sadis who walked into the forest in grief and returned no more. Some said she went mad. Others claimed she became a tree. But a generation later, her great-granddaughter claimed dreams where Sadis spoke of a place where pain sleeps and no blade is known. The saga dismisses this as women's fancy, but the story remained. The forest cults did not seek to overthrow society. They existed beside it, beneath it, like roots under a battlefield, quiet, unseen, but strong. When storms came, the halls might fall, but the roots endured. In a small glen above the fjord where Leif once lived, a circle of stones still stands. It is not marked on maps. The villagers call it the listening place. No one knows who built it, but every spring someone leaves a loaf of bread there, and a handful of flax, and a sprig of thyme, perhaps a custom passed down without meaning, or perhaps the last echo of a resistance older than the sagas, one that said, "You may keep your war gods and your blood feasts. We will keep the earth." They called him Thorgal Wordbinder, not for the number of men he had slain, but for the number of verses he had forged. He was a skald, a poet, keeper of memory, servant of the spoken world. In a culture where most lived and died without record, Thorgal's voice could grant immortality. He had sat in the mead halls of jarls and kings, reciting deeds with firelight on his brow. He knew the names of battles, the shapes of wounds, the rhythm of blood on snow. But one day, Thorgal stopped singing of war. No one knows the moment it changed. Perhaps it was on the eastern rivers, watching a boy drown beneath a burning ship. Perhaps it was on the Irish coast, where a woman cried over her fallen child while the warriors laughed. Perhaps it was nothing so dramatic, only the slow accumulation of pain, the weight of telling the same stories again and again, always ending in death, always wrapped in glory. He came home from the sea, older than his years, and laid down his harp. When the jarl asked him to compose a death song for the raid just returned, he refused. "No more songs for slaughter," he said. The room fell silent. Someone muttered that he had gone soft. Others scoffed, but the jarl said nothing. He only nodded, slow and hard, and dismissed him with a wave. Thorgal did not become an outlaw. He became something stranger, a skald who would not speak of war. Instead, he began to tell other stories. Stories of mothers who held villages together through famine, of blacksmiths who worked without rest to arm men they would never see again, of old women who remembered the names of every dead child and lit a candle for each. He sang of trees, of snow that fell like ash, of silence. At first, the people resisted. These were not songs that stirred the blood. They did not set men to motion. They asked for stillness. But slowly, people began to listen, because they recognized the truth beneath the words. Thorgal's verses did not praise fearlessness. They named it, questioned it. He once composed a single stanza about a man who stood in the shield wall and wept. He did not flee, but tears tracked through the soot on his face. His blade rose late. Still, he stood. That man, unnamed, became a symbol not of shame, but of honesty. Warriors, who had long kept their pain buried, found something in the verse that soothed. They began to speak to Thorgal, quietly, outside the hall. They told him things they had never told anyone. He did not write it down. He simply listened, and in listening, he bore witness. In Norse tradition, the skald is more than a poet. He is the vessel of memory, the voice through which the dead speak. His words shape legacy. Without him, no hero endures. But Thorgal chose to speak for the unremembered, the ones the sagas ignored, the men who did not return, the ones who came home but never spoke, the farmers who never sailed, the sons who refused the axe. He composed an epic not of war, but of waiting. It told of a young man named Bjorn, who watched his brothers sail west and chose to stay. He was mocked, shunned, forgotten. But when the harvest failed and wolves came down from the hills, it was Bjorn who kept the village fed. Bjorn who dug graves. Bjorn who wept when no one else had strength left to mourn. In the final verse, Thorgal does not elevate Bjorn. He simply says, he lived when others did not, and he remembered. The poem was never officially sung in the Jarl's hall, but it was copied, memorized, whispered from one village to another, carried by wandering skalds, not for coin but for need. Thorgal became a wanderer himself. He walked from settlement to settlement, never staying long. He carried no weapon, only a harp of blackened ash wood, strung with hair from his mother's loom. He sang beside cook-fires and in barns, on windswept cliffs, and deep within pine forests. To some, he was a traitor to the old ways, a voice of softness in a hard world. To others, he was a prophet. One winter, he came to Leif Haldarsson's hut. The two men sat across from one another in silence, each waiting for the other to speak. Finally, Thorgal said, "You bore shame for the truth I only sang. I owe you words." Leif shook his head. "No, you owe no one." Thorgal stayed the night. In the morning, he carved a single line into the beam above Leif's door. He did not need a song, but I sang anyway. Thorgal vanished after that. Some say he walked into the mountains. Others say he was killed by men who could not bear the sound of their own conscience. But a few claim he still walks the edges of the world, singing to the wind, binding words not for glory, but for grace. The skald who refused to praise death became a legend not because he sought it, but because he looked at a world of blades and spoke of gentler things. And in doing so, he reminded a people raised on war that there were other ways to be brave. The sagas are filled with roaring youth warriors in their prime, eager for battle, muscles hard as oak, voices like thunder. But what of those warriors who lived too long? Who survived the feuds, the raids, the longships lost at sea? What did they think, years later, with bones aching in the cold and no more foes to strike? The old are seldom the heroes in Norse tales, but they existed, and some, in their silence and solitude, began to whisper another truth: regret. In the twilight of life, glory fades, scars deepen. The strength that once swung an axe now struggles to lift a cup, and in that weakness, doubt creeps in, not always spoken, not always shared, but present. Men who once boasted of blood begin to count its cost, not in enemies slain but in brothers lost, sons buried, faces forgotten. One such man was Ketil Ironhand, a warrior remembered in 3 regional sagas as a great killer in the West. He was famed for holding a bridge alone against 5 Irish swordsmen and for cleaving a man from crown to collarbone with a single blow. In youth, he was fire, but when he reached 50 winters, something changed. He retired to his birthstead, refused to take up arms even when insulted, and was seen more often in the fields than the feast hall. A younger man once mocked him for carrying a walking stick instead of a sword. Ketil's answer was simple: one grows tired of sharpening iron that only opens graves. No one mocked him again. In another tale, found in a fragment of the Book of Settlements, a warrior named Armad returns from the east with a hoard of silver and a shattered knee. He builds a hall, invites no guests, and speaks to no one. After his death, a single verse is found scratched into the wall above his sleeping bench. I stood in blood and called it song. Now I hear only the wind. It is the closest thing to a confession found in the Norse record. Old warriors were respected but often pitied. They were reminders of a truth no one wanted to face: that all war ends in silence, that even the fiercest name will one day be spoken by none. Some tried to make peace with what they had done. They gave land to the families of those they had slain. They adopted orphans. They built small shrines to gods of peace or healing. These acts were quiet, never sung, but they mattered. In a rare passage from the saga of Gunnlaug's serpent tongue, an old fighter named Thorleif is asked why he no longer boasts of his youth. He replies, "Because I remember too clearly the screams, and because boasting does not bring back the dead." The Christian missionaries saw these doubts and seized upon them. They offered a new kind of redemption confession: forgiveness, salvation. Old warriors, too proud to kneel in battle, sometimes knelt in prayer. Not many, but enough. A man who had spent his life feeding the ravens could now hope for mercy from the Lamb. But even outside the church, change stirred. Some warriors simply passed their final years in solitude. They did not apologize. They did not atone. They simply stopped, sat by the sea, watched the stars, built nothing, spoke little. But in their stillness they carried a kind of wisdom that could not be tauntingly earned. Young men still sought them out, hoping for tales, hoping for fire. Some left disappointed, others left changed. One such youth came to Leif Haldarsson, asking if he regretted never fighting. Leif answered with a story not his own, but that of an old man who had come to him sick, carrying a ring once taken from a Saxon priest. "He gave it to me," Leif said, "told me to bury it, said it burned his hand. I asked why. He said he couldn't forget the priest's eyes, said he screamed, not in fear but in prayer." The boy asked, "Was he forgiven?" Leif shook his head. "He didn't ask to be. There is no formal record of Norse warriors repenting, no scroll of apologies. But in the sagas, in the runes, in the graves that grow quieter with each generation, there are echoes. A sword buried deeper in the ground, a grave with no name, a verse that ends not in triumph, but in longing. Redemption, for the Norse, was not promised, but regret. Regret was common as frost, and in that frost, sometimes, grew something like understanding. Not all warriors died in battle. Some lived long enough to wish they had not, and a few, just a few, lived long enough to change. For all that the sagas tell us, it is the graves that speak most honestly. Words can be bent, songs shaped to fit the ears of kings, but the earth does not lie. It holds its secrets in soil, in bone, in the arrangement of objects left beside the dead. And when we listen carefully, we find that not all Viking graves are filled with swords. Across Scandinavia, from the burial mounds of Uppsala to the wind-scoured fields of Vestfold, archaeologists have uncovered a strange silence graves of men buried without weapons. These were not paupers nor slaves. Many had fine clothes, imported beads, combs of carved bone, bowls of silver, and tools of craft. But no axe, no spear, no shield, no sign of battle. Who were these men? In a culture that prized martial death, where warriors were sent to Valhalla with their blades at their side and their names etched in stone, such burials raise questions. Were these men too poor to own weapons? Unlikely some graves are rich in goods. Were they criminals? The dishonored? There are no signs of punishment, no inverted bodies, no signs of violence. Instead, these graves suggest something more complicated, a different kind of life, a different kind of honor. Perhaps they were refusers. Perhaps they were the men like Leif Haldarsson, who chose not to fight and found a way to live without war. One grave in Gotland, dated to the 9th century, held a man of about 35. He was buried with a carpenter's tools, a wooden bowl, and a pouch of seeds. His bones bore no wounds. His teeth were worn from use, his hands calloused. No weapons, no armor. But nearby, the graves of women and children were oriented toward his. Whoever he was not forgotten. In Denmark, at a site near Ribe, archaeologists uncovered a long grave with 3 offerings: a fishing net, a small stone carved with runes meaning patience, and a carved animal tooth etched with waves, a Geno blade. Yet the grave was carefully made, the body wrapped in fine wool. In Norway, a burial at Kaupang held a man with several strange items: a knife for carving wood, a game board, a pouch of dried mushrooms, and a fragment of an Irish gospel page. He had traveled, he had returned, and he had chosen not to carry steel into the afterlife. These graves do not shout, they whisper. They tell us that Viking society, so often remembered for its violence, also had room, however small, for those who walked another path. Not every man who died with honor did so by the sword, and the silence around these graves is itself revealing. They are rarely discussed in old texts. The sagas favor the spectacular, the battlefield, the blood feast, but real life was not lived in verses. It was lived in farms, in boats, in small acts of endurance. These graves remind us that the sagas were not the whole story. Sometimes, the most telling thing is what was not buried. No weapons may mean no war, but it may also mean a final refusal to not be remembered as a killer, to not carry death into the next world. In Iceland, there is a grave known as the Gentle One. The name is modern, given by scholars, not by kin. The man was buried alone, far from any settlement. No signs of trauma. Only a stone bowl, a pair of worn shoes, and a small knife for preparing food. His bones suggest arthritis, and his ribcage shows signs of healed illness. But someone took the time to line his grave with birch bark, an offering of care. Who was he? No one knows. But perhaps he was someone who chose peace. The archaeological record is not complete. It is fragmentary, uncertain, but its silences are meaningful. And when we place these graves beside the stories of Leif, of Eric, of the unnamed skalds and silent returners, a pattern emerges, a thread of quiet resistance, a path not taken by many, but taken nonetheless. In a world that praised warriors, these men were buried without weapons, and yet with dignity. That alone is an act of remembrance. That alone is a kind of legacy. They did not seek glory, but they found something else, a kind of stillness that even the sagas could not erase. In the old halls of the north, where firelight once danced on axe blades and skalds wove glory from blood, the tales of warriors reigned. They still do, in memory, in saga, in song. But beneath those thunderous verses, another current flows, a quieter tale, uncarved in stone, unpraised in feast, yet no less enduring. The story of those who refused. They were not many, nor were they loud. They left behind few boasts, fewer monuments. Their names are not etched in rune stones beside fjords, nor sung in the war songs of proud descendants. But they lived, and in that living, they offered a different kind of heroism. Theirs was the courage of standing still when the world demanded charge, the courage of silence in a culture that demanded roar, the courage of enduring shame, exile, hunger, and scorn, not for lack of bravery, but for conviction, for choice. In the saga of Leif Haldarsson, we have followed one such path. A young man born into war, shaped for the shield wall, fated to wield an axe, and yet, who said no, and in saying no, he opened a wound in his family, his people, even his gods. But from that wound flowed something rarely seen in Norse tales: peace. Leif did not become a saint. He did not convert a kingdom. He did not escape sorrow. His life was hard, marked by hunger, loneliness, long winters, and lingering suspicion. But it was also marked by healing, by hands that mended instead of maimed, by words that calmed instead of provoked, by soil turned to grain, not to graves. And in his quiet, others found shelter: a broken warrior who left his sword behind, a widow who refused to raise her sons for slaughter, a skald who sang not of blood but of bread and firelight and the steady pulse of the land, a priest perhaps who saw in Leif not heresy but holiness. Their stories intersect like trails in the snow, crossing briefly, then vanishing. But together, they form a hidden map, a constellation of resistance, not to clan or kin, but to a myth that claimed death was the only road to honor. Even the gods, in their cold halls, may have heard it. For if Odin is truly wise, might he not honor wisdom over war? If Freya truly chooses half the dead, might she not choose the gentle? And if the land spirits still linger in stone and stream, might they not favor the hand that plants, not plunders? The Norse world was not a monolith. It was a storm of contradiction, harsh and beautiful, brutal and profound. It celebrated the axe, yes, but it also tended gardens. It wrote poems about killing, but also about longing, sorrow, endurance. And in that space, between frost and fire, there was room for those who chose another way. The quiet courage, it is not easily praised. It does not lend itself to saga, but it survives. In the graves without weapons, in the tools passed down, worn smooth by use, in the herb lore whispered from mother to daughter, in the man who stands apart at the feast, eyes turned not to the mead hall, but to the stars beyond the smoke hole. In you, perhaps, reading these words, in the choice you make, to fight or not, to follow or to refuse. The story of the Vikings who turned from battle is not a story of weakness. It is a story of another kind of strength, one that endures not in fire, but in silence, not in saga, but in soil.